Thank you, everybody, for being with us today. We wanted to have the opportunity to share a little bit about the work that we've been doing on the Racial Equity Advancement Fund with the work group and allow a little bit of time for questions, comments, and feedback from the community as a part of our process before it goes to the Commission for Diversity and Inclusion to be voted on, which then will go to the Select Board. So just for a bit of just technical things to start with, I'm going to go through the presentation. If you have questions or comments, feel free to use the question and answer box. If you have something you want to say, I believe you can raise your hand and Lloyd will give you permission to speak before we allow you, and then we'll put you back on mute. So for context, in the fall 2019 town meeting resolved that the Select Board should establish an appropriation to support a racial equity advancement fund to be funded by revenue received from some source of marijuana revenue. Through the Racial Equity Advancement Fund, the Office of Diversity, Inclusion, Community Relations, and in collaboration with the Commission of Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations will be a resource for individuals, community organizations, nonprofits, and other town entities seeking funding to support projects, programs, and initiatives that advance racial equity and racial justice within the Brookline community. We have formed the Racial Equity Work Group, a Racial Equity Advancement Fund Work Group, which consists of staff from the Office of Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations, staff from the Economic Development Division, a representative from the Select Board, representative from the Commission of Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations, as well as several community members. The work group met weekly. We did a lot of research on grant processes with a racial equity and racial justice lens, as well as looking at other similar grant processes that were available. We collaborated to develop a Racial Equity Advancement Fund grant process, an RFP, as well as an application. We also collaborated to develop an evaluation process. So the first thing we did was establish goals for the Racial Equity Advancement Fund. The number one goal of REAF is to bring about racial equity and racial justice in all aspects of life, including education, health, and economic equity in the town of Brookline. The group really focused on community engagement as a priority goal throughout the entire process of establishing and implementing the REAF fund. We wanted to be sure to include outreach and technical assistance during the application process, as well as engage the community in helping to annually assess and focus the fund's priorities. So for 2020-2021, the priorities that the work group identified that we felt would most respond to community and organizational needs to address racial inequities and support proposals that would include, but are not limited to, the economic advancement for businesses owned by people of color, closing the educational opportunity gap, addressing needs of Brookline Housing Authority residents, advancing racial equity in Brookline science, technology, engineering, arts, and math, advancing racial equity in Brookline arts and culture, addressing health disparities, and increasing civic engagement. After doing a lot of research on racial justice and racial equity lenses, the group was particularly interested in allowing REAF to prioritize proposals that address the structural and systemic nature of the racial inequity being addressed, viewing project participants as agents of change, including participants or recipients in the project's decision-making processes, building individual and collective power of the program participants, developing leadership capacity, and/or including participants in validating and refining the project metrics as the project or program continues. Eligibility to apply for the Racial Equity Advancement Fund would be tax-exempt organizations that meet the requirements of Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Service Code. If an organization or project is new or not tax-exempt, an application may be submitted through an organization that has agreed to serve as a fiscal sponsor. We had a lot of conversation about this, and we really did not want this to be a barrier to innovative ideas and projects. So the Office of Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations will assist applicants in identifying an appropriate fiscal sponsor, as well as connect the applicant with a representative from the suggested fiscal sponsor. Town departments or entities who would like to apply for funds must provide evidence of significant community engagement and community support for the proposal. All grant applications will need to comply with applicable local, state, and federal rules and regulations, and funding will be awarded subject to Town Council's review. Again, we didn't want this to be a barrier, so grant applicants will be encouraged to work with our office to modify their proposal to address any such legal concerns if they come up. An eligible organization must be operated and organized so that it does not discriminate in the hiring of staff or provision of services on the basis of race, religion, gender identity, sexual orientation, age, national origin, or disability. The submission guidelines we have outlined in the RFP, as well has also been translated onto the application form pretty much in this exact order. So each submitted proposal will be expected to contain the following information. We want to see a proposal summary and how it relates to one or more of the REAP priorities. We would like to see clearly defined goals and objectives of the proposal. We suggest the use of SMART goals as they are applicable. We would like to know who the target audience or participants for the proposal are. We would like to know the current need and what the expected impact will be. And we also would like applicants to think of the potential barriers to participation for their program or proposal that they're submitting, and any limitations that they may have to identify and work around. For budget, we want to know who is responsible for the financial operations, the current, if any, sources of funding, as well as an itemization of each area that's needed to operate the program and proposal. And we will be providing a budget template that applicants can fill out and send back to us. We also want to know the expected outcomes in relation to the impact, the expected timeline that the project or program would be running on, as well as evaluation and reporting process, how the success of the project will be demonstrated and measured. The group also discussed several grantee responsibilities that we wanted to make clear in the RFP. We require that all grantee proposals actively support and engage in programs that work to achieve racial equity within the town of Brookline. It's expected that grantees will strive for diversity within their organization, as well as serve a diverse and multifaceted population. It is expected that each grantee will be responsible for articulating how their proposal meets the goal of the Racial Equity Advancement Fund, for periodically reporting progress to the Commission for Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations, as well as submitting an evaluation once the project or program is completed. And lastly, we would like the grantees to develop a process to ensure that their project or program can become self-sustaining over time, if that is applicable and it's not a one-time project. So for deadlines, applications will be available electronically at a website link, as well as in hard copies. Proposals, the group's thinking proposals will be accepted biannually, with filing deadlines of January 1st and July 1st. Determinations would be made several months after each, respectively, April 1st and October 1st. For technical assistance on the RFP and the application, we will include the following language. For any questions pertaining to the application process, potential proposal ideas, application content, or any other assistance in completing the application, please contact the Assistant Director in the Office of Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations, which will have my number and email address. Lastly, the group discussed evaluation metrics. First, we discussed project evaluations and wanted each proposal to have a plan to evaluate the impact of their work. We wanted to make sure that the impact needs were measured both quantitatively and qualitatively. We wanted to see if there was evidence of change and that goals be outcome-based in order to better evaluate against. We also discussed quarterly feedback for the DICR Commission to get from each of the projects that were granted, allowing the SMART goals to be flexible based on things that were learned through the processes realized by the grantee. And the Commission would like to learn what the organization or entity learned from their process. What went well, what did not go well, what would be done differently next time. And lastly, we wanted to make sure that we evaluated our own work. We wanted to measure the success of engagement, the number of applications we received, the projects that were funded, and any barriers that we encountered through the process from qualitative information from any applicants. Okay, so that is what the work that we have done. I'm happy to take questions and answer any comments or feedbacks. I can also get, you can reach me via email or on the phone, and I'm happy to talk to you personally and reach out individually as well. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can see other things. So this process has taken several months. And as I mentioned, this is where we are now. We have the RFP. All of the language you just saw in the presentation is as it is written in the RFP. The application has been developed. Right now it is a Google form. We are still working on how we would like to, if we want to use that format or if we want to use a different format. So we just wanted to bring this to the community, get feedback, and answer any questions that people may have, if there are any.
None as of yet. Oh, yes. Stone.
Yeah, can you, she has her hand raised.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Can I unmute my?
You're on.
Oh, there we go. Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Nice to see your face and yours. So I have a bunch of questions, but the most important one actually is how much money do you expect to have in this fund?
So our group, in the beginning, we had talked about funding grant proposals and how the maximum that people could apply for. And at the time, I think our maximum we talked about being between 50 and 100,000. With anybody who wanted to apply for more than that, we would review based on what was available in the fund. However, things have certainly changed from there, and our group has been tasked with focused on funding the guidelines and grant proposal review process, and projections of appropriations will need to be addressed to the town administrator's office. Unfortunately, I don't have the information of how much is currently going to be in the fund or how much we can expect in the fund in the future.
So I must confess, I'm really stuck on that because I don't understand how you can, I don't understand how you, Brookline, can develop a process and communicate it to anyone without a sense of what kind of project is able to be funded, right? Are we talking about $500 or are we talking about $50,000? And that's going to depend on how much is in the fund. And I went looking just because I was really curious about this. I looked through as careful as I could the fiscal 21 budget book from the town, and the fund isn't listed. I assume that it would be in the special revenue funds, and it's not there in name, it's not there in intent. So as far as fiscal 21 is concerned, there isn't even a place to put funds, even if a miracle occurs and there are funds to put there. So I'm just curious about, it just feels like developing this process feels like putting the cart before the horse. And I don't want us to be in the position of going out to the community with an opportunity and not being able to tell them that most important thing, which is, what are we really offering?
So Lloyd, please jump in if you have anything to say, but I do know that before this process is opened up for any kind of actual submissions, we will need to have that information. I don't know when that will be, but Lloyd, if you could speak to that, that would be.
Yeah, as Caitlin pointed out, our mission was to make sure that we had a process in place with the understanding that there will be funding for it. The amount we don't know, but I think that's a question that we best be addressed by the town administrator and the select board, where the money's coming from and how much. And then obviously we'll base our distribution of successful grants, the funds based on that number, but we don't know what that number is. And I hear what you're saying, Rebecca. We don't know, but we just don't know it at this point.
Yeah, no, and I hear what you're saying too, and I imagine that's enormously frustrating. So, I was literally just trying to get a sense in my own head of what the timeline for the fund was, because you guys have put already a lot of work into thinking through this, but having done a fair amount of philanthropy and myself, it's very, very hard. So for example, your evaluation metrics, right? That requiring evaluations of people that are both qualitative and quantitative, right? I used to make grants of somewhere between $10,000 and $100,000 to organizations that had operating budgets of about $1 million, and even asking an organization of that size for quantitative outcome measures on a project that we were contributing maybe $10,000 to was really asking more than most of those organizations could supply. And so I would really urge you, as you think through this, to think in the most general terms of what kind of evaluation will be most helpful to the commission and to the office for understanding whether or not this fund is doing what you wanted it to do. But putting the onus on the grantees for evaluation that they are probably never going to be able to give you really adds stress to organizations that are already usually operating at fairly low margins in terms of what they get in. So I would just really recommend starting with, yes, an expectation that any grant is going to have a conversation at the end about what was accomplished, but starting out with you will be expected to do this level of evaluation, and it has all these things and SMART goals, and just it freaks out not-for-profits that are applying, especially for small grants. And I think in terms of engaging the community and getting a group of folks started, I would just recommend easing back on the evaluation metrics as sort of going out there strong in the beginning. I would go out there softly on evaluation in the beginning to engage people and not to freak them out. The other question I had, just when you were going through it quickly, Caitlin, is do we know what the Community Foundation already funds in this general area? Because this feels like something that could be run through the Brookline Community Foundation just as easily as run through the commission, and they already have all of these processes in place. And I wondered whether that was thought about by the group.
As far as amount of money wise, no, I did not look into that, but we did use their structure and application process very similarly, especially for their spotlight grants, to kind of mimic what they're doing. And the discussion of having it go through them, I believe, came up in our work group, but as this is town money, those are questions for smarter people than I to answer.
Okay.
But we did look at them, and I know that it is a discussion that did happen originally, and this is what we have decided to go with for now. As far as your comment about the qualitative and quantitative, I completely agree, and I thank you for saying that. There was conversation early on with the group about the different amounts that people were asking for, and people asking for smaller amounts would not be kind of held to the same evaluation measures that some of the much larger projects were. And then again, we're going to need to revisit that once we know exactly what our limits are for this fund. But I do appreciate the comments. Thank you.
And then I just had one last question, which is, it's a definitional question. We have special revenue funds on things like there's something called the curse gift, which is about Hidden Brookline. There's the Russian American Festival. There's the MLK Service Day. There's the African American Heritage Program. I'm sorry, Asian American Heritage Program, all of which are already funds that exist. And I'm curious is there anything in the explanation of this fund when we talk about racial equity? Are we talking essentially or specifically, maybe even explicitly about Black and Brown? How broad is the definition of racial equity that's being employed?
From my perspective, it's a very broad definition. And those funds that you mentioned, they are very specific to what they fund, and they're not very large amounts, and they're already being used by groups annually. So Lloyd, did you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I was just going to say what you're saying. Those funds do exist, and those funds are actually replenished by community dollars going into those grants, and some of those haven't been touched for years. But as Caitlin said, this grant, it's for racial equity. So those groups that have been traditionally marginalized or impacted through racial disparity will be the ones that we focus on. So,
okay.
We have two other questions. This is from Luciana. Are undocumented residents allowed to send proposals? Also, is the application going to be in other languages?
The application will definitely be in other languages. And yes, we do not have any kind of restrictions as long as there's a fiscal sponsor that the money can be sent to. There is no restrictions on who can apply.
All right, and Shoma is asking also, will this be a one-year request? It's helpful to know the timeline and potential dollar amount to know what program to even base an application around.
Can we let Shoma speak? I'm not sure I understand without seeing that in front of me.
Shoma, you're on. Well, she was on. Hands raised, but it was not letting me click. Why not? There we go. Shoma?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Shoma. Yes, hi.
Hi, Caitlin. Hi, Lloyd. Thank you so much. Sorry if it wasn't clear. I typed that, I think, as Rebecca was asking her question. It was of a similar vein of to have a sense of both the timeline for the request as well as the dollar range would be helpful to know what exactly we would be, proposing around. There's a big difference between a $5,000 program versus a $50,000 program, obviously. So.
Right. So around the dollar range, again, unfortunately, we don't know exactly how much we have, but when we were talking about this, after it had first been voted on, and we were assuming a very large pot of money. We had discussed, the work group had discussed having grants as low as 5,000 and as high as 100,000, depending on the project, and each project having its own kind of weight in the discussion when the commission was looking at them. So being able to fund smaller grants as well as one or two larger projects a year as well. And then as far as the timing question, the project would be, it would need to be within the same fiscal year as they were applying for, but the timeline would be based on what the organization needed for their project. Does that make sense?
So, for example, our fiscal years from July 1st to June 30th, would that be a timeline that would be acceptable?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
That's all the questions I see. That's all the questions I see, Caitlin.
All right.
Unless Rebecca has, oh, Arthur has a question.
Oh.
Arthur, you're on.
Hi, Arthur.
Arthur? Arthur? Yeah, he is unmuted, so.
Arthur, for whatever reason, we can't hear you, but you can call me or send me an email with your question, and I'm happy to answer it, as well as all the feedback and questions that everybody's asking today will be brought back to the full working group to discuss before we finish our draft to send to the Commission for Diversity. We're also going to have this recording on our website. So if you know of people who are interested and have other questions, please let them know that there is a recording that will be available.
Okay, we do have another question from Vishnu.
Okay.
Does it have to be an organization, or can individuals also apply?
So that's a great question, Vishnu, thank you. We had a lot of questions around this. I think it would depend on what an individual is requesting and if they could find an organization to sponsor them. Because we do want, or the group did want some of these funds to impact, for instance, Brookline housing residents directly. So we did talk about being able to fund individuals. It would depend again on the proposal, but our office would work with individuals who had questions specifically on their proposal during the application process and making sure that their project would be eligible.
Vishnu says thank you, and that's all I see so far. Questions? Okay, Kaya wants to speak for Arthur. Arthur's microphone is not working. So.
Okay.
All right, Kaya, you're on.
So Yeah. Um, I have Arthur on the phone here, so I hope this doesn't interfere. So he's asking, I think this question already got answered, and I may have missed.
How long is the duration of the funding? In other words, just
Yeah.
1 year.
Yes, I understand, Arthur. So how long is the duration of the funding? Is it just a 1-year thing? And the other question he had is this one-time funding. In other words, I think is what you're saying is, could the people come back for another round of funding potentially?
Right.
It would, yes, thank you, Arthur. It would depend on what that project was, how large the grant was. If, it's a huge project and there's funding from other sources, we would try and work with that project to make sure that they could be self-sufficient in the future. But for smaller grants that don't have any other sources of funding and was successful, we would continue to allow applications from them, I believe is what the work group decided.
Did you hear that, Arthur?
I did.
Okay, great.
Okay. Tell them thank you.
Thank you. He says
Thank you.
Tell them my microphone doesn't work.
Somehow his microphone doesn't work. I don't know if he's listening with an earphone, then he may not have a microphone connected to his earphone. I don't know.
It is possible, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Sometimes people can't listen through the computer because there's no sound system with the computer. That means they have to use an earphone.
Do you plug the earphone in?
Oh.
Okay.
So you can mute me. Did you mute me? Okay.
Yeah, Lloyd, you can mute them.
Are you?
All right, are there any other questions or comments that we can answer live?
I am not seeing any.
Okay, well,
Well, Shoma's hand's raised. I don't know. I'm going to unmute her. Shoma, do you have another question?
No, sorry, that was my question from earlier.
Okay, thanks.
all right. Well, if there are no other questions, I just want to thank everybody for coming today, asking the questions and feedback as well, and thanks to the working group to consider. I believe that the commission will have a public hearing when they vote on this. The select board will have a public hearing, so it'll be another chance to see this before it gets voted on. This is just kind of our first round of community input. And as I mentioned, I will be sending around the link to the recording to a broader group of residents so that we can get feedback from as many people as possible. And it would be wonderful if everybody could share that link as well.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of the day.
Have a good afternoon.